One of the most successful directors working today is Christopher Nolan. With his films full of intricate plotting that play with our perception of time, it is impressive how he's become one of those filmmakers where several people will see something just because he is the director. He has developed a strong track record, and there's something appealing about his work and his attempts to excite an audience. I found enjoyment in all of his movies, although like everyone I have my personal favorites. Nolan began his feature directing career with an extremely micro-budget film he shot on weekends with friends. That movie was Following, and while essentially a student film, even though he never went to film school, you can already see the seeds being planted that he would later expand on in his bigger movies. It follows a non-linear structure, something he would employ in multiple movies, and played around with timelines, so you constantly have to pay attention to where in the story events are happening. We also see his fascination with the criminal underworld and how people work outside the law operate. The film shows the plotting and scheming taken by the antagonist and the effect this has on the lead character, in this case an aspiring writer finding inspiration by following people on the streets of London. Nolan even named one of the principal characters Cobb, which he would later reuse for the lead protagonist in Inception. Outside of noticing the common themes and elements of his filmography, Following does present an intriguing narrative and a smart use of the budget and locations. Although Christopher Nolan always had bigger ambitions, and it was all a matter of waiting for the right studio and investors to give him that opportunity. The movie that would introduce many people to Nolan was Memento, and I think it may have been the first film I saw of his too. He would showcase his puzzle box way of telling stories here to tremendous effect by telling the narrative backwards and then also weaving in flashbacks. It's a screenplay that must have been quite complicated to write, but Nolan pulled it off. Rather than feeling like a gimmick, it becomes a major part of the main character and constantly makes you think back to previous scenes as you put the pieces together. And watching again, knowing how everything unravels, does not lessen the experience. If anything, it adds to the appreciation of the film and how it's structured and develops the characters. As you watch the events play out, you feel the same distrust that Leonard feels about those around him. A common thing said about Nolan's work is how complicated his stories are. When you pay attention and really key in on what is happening in the scenes, they do make a lot of sense and are not that difficult to figure out. Nolan would get his chance to direct his first studio film with Insomnia, a remake of a Norwegian film, and he seamlessly made the jump. He presented a solid thriller with focus on the characters, particularly Al Pacino's sleep-deprived detective. This is the only movie Nolan did not receive a screenwriting credit on, and was necessary in placing him in the trust of studios, specifically Warner Brothers. So it is an important stepping stone for him, and the reason they entrusted him with one of their biggest franchises. That was, of course, Batman, with Nolan eager to take on a character he'd long been a fan of. It was also an enormous responsibility, as he had to get people back on board and wanting to see a Batman movie after Batman and Robin caused the previous series to grind to a halt. With Batman Begins, he succeeded in not only telling the origin story of the Caped Crusader, but made the serious tone fit the character, while still including several of his hallmarks. Nolan delivered with the action sequences, but he also managed to explore Bruce Wayne's arc with the needed depth as he attempts to rid Gotham City of its problems and prevent future children from suffering the same loss as him. I personally prefer the second half when he becomes Batman over the first half, probably because I've always found Ra's al Ghul to be an interesting villain, but Nolan still made that section of the movie compelling. The Dark Knight would take things to the next level and present further dilemmas for Bruce to solve. The Joker, played brilliantly by Heath Ledger, and Harvey Dent played especially key roles in his storyline as he tries to protect his city and sees promise in Dent being the man to do it. The Dark Knight has been endlessly praised since its release, including by me, and it truly was a phenomenon back in the summer of 2008, so there's not more I can really say about it that other people already haven't. I agree with the consensus that it's one of the best superhero movies ever made, with Nolan taking a semi-realistic approach, but still providing the action and spectacle we seek in these kinds of films. I also loved what he did with The Dark Knight Rises, depicting the storylines involving Bruce, Selina Kyle, James Gordon, Bane, and a rookie policeman. It continued to provide the incredible scale and action set pieces, but it also deals with Bruce still wanting to help the city, even as it's somewhat turned against Batman. And after facing his toughest adversary yet, we see his drive to try and return to the city he's known for so long, as it ends up under siege. Nolan crafted a thrilling and emotional story for this final chapter in his Batman trilogy, and I was completely satisfied with how it concluded. A lot of people consider this to be the weakest of the films, but I disagree with them, especially when some of the criticisms amount to nitpicks like how did Bruce Wayne get back into Gotham City, as if he doesn't know every nook, cranny, and secret hiding spot there. We don't need to see scenes like that, and Christopher Nolan is a filmmaker who has shown he respects the audience's intelligence to piece things together based on what they know about the characters at that point in the story. As for the trilogy as a whole, I think he did a tremendous job of depicting Bruce's journey to vigilante crime fighter and everything that entails. The filmmaking on display in these films is tremendous, as well as how he handles the heroes, villains, and those in between. Even Gotham City changes and evolves, going from something more akin to the comic portrayal in Batman Begins, to Chicago in The Dark Knight, to New York City in The Dark Knight Rises. When we look back at this era of superhero movies decades from now, I think Nolan's Batman trilogy will stand as one of the best series to come out of it. Of course, he also made a few notable films in between that highlighted his love of layered narratives. The Prestige took on the world of magic, although the first time I saw it, I was underwhelmed. I particularly found the final twist to be a disappointing reveal. However, upon revisiting the movie years later, I better appreciated what he set out to do, and as usual with Nolan, he does a lot of clever things with time. Even that final twist is a clever build-up on top of how the film recreates the period details. Looking at his filmography as a whole, it makes sense why he would want to make a film about magicians, as the entire deal is using the way we perceive reality to show something miraculous, and Nolan treats film in a similar way. He would also explore the concept of dreams with Inception, which was a particularly ambitious production on his part. So ambitious that he knew he had to wait until he proved himself on big-budget, large-scale films before a studio would agree to produce it. Nolan pulled it off and created a film full of visually inspired moments, and it makes a unique twist on the heist film. Even as Inception spends time explaining the concept to us, the script makes it all intriguing and not all complicated to follow. The set pieces are expertly put together, and the characters pulling off this heist all develop distinct personalities. The movie manages to keep one guessing until the end and pulling off new impressive feats with each layer of the dream world the characters go down. Christopher Nolan would go to outer space with his next film, Interstellar, which continued to play around with time. With the work of Kip Thorne as a major influence, it's definitely a heady film and one of Nolan's more philosophical works, as it explores the roles our familiar relationships play in the universe. Admittedly, this film does not grab me as emotionally as it does other people, and while it's a visually impressive science fiction film with solid ideas, I was more invested in its depiction of the future and what Coop finds in outer space than necessarily the characters. It is a good movie, though. People have a lot of love for Interstellar, and I understand why. It's a film of intriguing ideas, and Nolan absolutely put a lot of thought into the story and how he would bring it to the screen. However, both times I've seen it, I've admired its ambitions more than I was necessarily entertained by it. My favorite Christopher Nolan film is Dunkerk. I think this is a tremendously well-constructed World War II movie that puts you in the shoes of the soldiers during this evacuation from the beaches of Dunkirk. The film cuts between 3 separate timelines, each focusing on a different aspect, and all prove compelling, and most of all tackle the fear felt by both soldiers and civilians during this ordeal. It's one of Nolan's most technically impressive films too, with every gunshot leaving an impact. The film uses dialogue only when absolutely necessary and becomes a gripping depiction of this event. Whether focusing on the soldiers on the beach, people on a boat heading there, or a pilot in the sky, Dunkirk is a remarkable feat of filmmaking. This was his first film based on a real event, and he handled it with a needed respect for those who found themselves on the beach that day. With Tenant, Nolan directed what was basically his take on a James Bond movie. He's often talked about his love for that franchise, and can see that influence in a lot of his work, particularly on Her Majesty's Secret Service for a major set piece in Inception. Tenant decided to mix the secret agent movie with a time travel plot, and in typical Nolan fashion, he puts a unique spin on both of these. The backwards time effect and large-scale set pieces allow for a lot of striking visuals, and while many found the film and its explanation of the concept to be complicated, I did not find it to be that difficult to understand. When you break it down, it's the familiar storyline of a villain who wants to use a dangerous device for his diabolical deeds, and the central hero, who literally calls himself the protagonist, has to stop him, all while dealing with a bunch of obstacles in his way. I found Tenant to be another impressively thought out and creative story on Nolan's part. However, one thing I will say is I was not a fan of the sound mixing. The dialogue was hard to hear, with so much of the music and sound effects covering it up to the point I had to switch the subtitles on. I also had that issue of Interstellar and parts of Inception, but curiously not his other films. Nolan has defended this by saying he wants the sound mix to be realistic and that you would not be able to fully hear someone over crashing waves and other sounds. Fair enough, but maybe don't put important exposition where loud noise might be occurring. His most recent film is Oppenheimer, which was widely praised and won the Oscar for Best Picture. However, this is another Nolan film like Interstellar where I liked it, but did not share the same adoration as other people. I think it's a well-made history lesson that does give a solid overview on J. Robert Oppenheimer's creation of the atomic bomb and the aftermath of that. It managed to show why he sought to make it, and then how he supposedly felt about its eventual usage. It presents some intriguing themes about how it feels to be responsible for something that causes so much destruction. However, I did think the presentation was a tad dry, and like I said, felt like reading a history textbook, albeit a beautifully filmed one with a fantastic musical score. A lot of the film is structured through a series of little scenes, with it also jumping back and forth between time periods. I did watch Oppenheimer a second time in preparation for this video to see if my opinion would change. However, I felt exactly the same as I did when I saw it in the theater. I think it's a good movie, but not one I have particularly strong feelings about. However, as you can see, while I prefer some Christopher Nolan movies more than others, I have liked everything he's directed. And even films like Following and The Prestige, where I initially did not have a handle on them the first time, I eventually came around to on a revisit. I'm certainly intrigued about his next film, an adaptation of Homer's The Odyssey, which is currently filming. It feels like a fit right at home of his penchant for making movies of epic scopes and major set pieces, and I'm particularly curious how he'll handle the more fantastical elements of the story. Although what's great about Christopher Nolan is that while he has his favorite themes, like any director, he does try to do different things and experiment with each new film he makes. Despite his love for spectacle and playing with time and structure, he also understands the importance of character and showing us ones we want to follow on their journeys. He is an immensely talented filmmaker full of ideas swirling in his head, and a particular love for using the large canvas of cinema to bring these concepts to the screen. And whether you view his movies in IMAX like he hopes, or at home, you're bound to get something creative. See you next time.